Hello and welcome to the CNBC TV 18 Newsmaker. I'm Shireen Bhan. Prime Minister Modi stressed that the universal sense of oneness will guide India as it formally took over the reins of the presidency of the G20, a bloc of the world's richest economies, for the next 1 year. India will hold around 200 events across 55 cities during its tenure. Its tenure will culminate into the annual summit of G20 leaders in September next year. Speaking at an event today, External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar said G20 will make the world more India-ready and also India more world-ready. The Information and Broadcasting Secretary Apurv Chandra, speaking to CNBC TV 18, said that events across multiple cities will give India an opportunity to showcase its tourism potential and much more. Well, joining me now is the man who is spearheading India's efforts of organizing the G20 events. I'm joined by Amitabh Kant, India's G20 Sherpa. Mr. Kant, many thanks for joining us here on CNBC TV 18. The Prime Minister has written an op-ed this morning, which has been published across all newspapers, talking us through what India has planned as far as the G20 is concerned. Before I address the specifics, Mr. Kant, I want to understand, and I'm sure many of our viewers want to understand as well, the execution challenge starts from today, the 1st of December, when we have assumed the presidency of the G20. But the planning phase has been on for months now. Take us through the man-hours spent already on being able to get to this point.
Okay. So, Shireen, first and foremost, when you take over the presidency of G20, you are dealing with a grouping which accounts for about 85% of the global GDP and about 78% of the global trade. So it's a huge responsibility. The Prime Minister wants India's presidency, as he's written in today's editorial in most papers, to be very action-oriented. He wants it to be very ambitious. He wants it to be very decisive. And more than anything else, he wants India to be very different from other countries, and he wants to leave the stamp of India, the India narrative during India's presidency. There are various challenges which India is confronted with. There's the geopolitical challenge. There is global supply chain disruption, the global debt. There is a vast number of people, 200 million people have gone below poverty line post-COVID, 100 million people have lost their jobs. And therefore, when leaders of G20, and that's important to understand, that one bit is that we do a lot of work through working groups, finance tracks, engagement groups, but when the leaders of G20 meet and they interact on September 9th and 10th here, this will be the biggest grouping of leaders ever held. There will be our invitees, there will be international organizations, so there will be 43 leaders from all over the world. This will be the biggest gathering of leaders here. They will carry the responsibility of actually leading the world on behalf of the citizens of the world. So they'll carry a huge amount of responsibility. And as Sherpa, the Sherpa is supposed to take the leader right on top of the peak of the Mount Everest. So the challenge there is that how do we make this very action-oriented? And I think there the Prime Minister has spelled out in his editorial what India's priorities would be. One is that at this particular moment, there's a looming crisis of slowdown of growth all across the world. And this is essentially an economic grouping. So how do we accelerate the pace of inclusive, resilient, sustainable growth will be a key challenge before the leaders of the world. The second key challenge to my mind will be that vast segments of the population have been impacted by education, health, due to post-COVID era, the Sustainable Development Goals. We will be midway through the 2030 action plan. Instead of progressing, we have actually regressed. And therefore, how do you accelerate the pace of this lifting people above the poverty line will be a central issue. Thirdly, I think to my mind, if you want to lift people above the poverty line, if you want to make a big difference, then you have to use technology to leapfrog, and therefore digital transformation, whether the model which India has built up of digital public infrastructure that is allowing rail tracks to be built on top of which the private sector has innovated. The model of open source, open APIs, interoperability, can this be replicated across many other countries of the world, and can India provide that model? Fourthly, I think the Prime Minister is very clear that health, India has a unique model. India is the pharmacy of the world. India is the vaccine capital of the world. It has provided vaccines through Vaccine Maitri. So how do we accelerate the Indian model, which is integrated wellness, Ayurveda, and yoga, etc.? Can this model of can assist the rest of the world? And when we do this, and we want to accelerate the pace of climate action and climate finance, which the developed world had committed to in 2009 at Copenhagen, which it has not lived up to. How do you push that agenda? And as a consequence of that, the reforms of multilateral institutions, they were built in the post-Bretton Woods, post-World War II period. Can we reform these institutions which India has been pursuing for a long time? And lastly, the PM has emphasized in his Bali speech very strongly that women constitute more than 50% of India's population, and so in the world as well. So if how do you can't grow at rapid pace till women-led development, and he's used the word women-led development, and therefore how do you bring in greater level of leadership? How do you bring in greater financial inclusion? How do you improve health, education outcomes, learning outcomes for them? And how do you put them into positions of authority and power? And that will be a very critical issue to deal with. So these are the broad priorities which India will deal with. There are many other priorities in the working group of Sherpas. Each working group, there are 13 working groups of Sherpas, there are 8 working groups, 8 finance track issues, there are about 12 engagement groups. All of us converge, integrate to take some of these priorities forward.
Well, Mr. Kant, thank you very much for very comprehensively summarizing for us the 7 priority areas. I noted them down as you were speaking, the 7 priority areas that India wants to put on the table as far as the G20 is concerned. And I do want to highlight the fact, the last issue that you spoke of, women-led development, gender parity, those are issues that we take very seriously here. In fact, we've just launched our Future Female Forward campaign addressing exactly that issue. So I'm glad that it is being given pride of place as far as India's agenda for the G20 is concerned. But Mr. Kant, let's address some of the complexities within which the G20 meeting is going to take place and something that India is going to have to negotiate and steer its way through. When you spoke with us from Bali, you talked about how India, along with several other countries, played a crucial role in changing the text, the final communique of the G20, because you didn't want it to look like a political statement. You wanted there to be consensus between countries. Now, the Prime Minister in his op-ed talks about the fact that we do not need to fight for our survival. Our era need not be one of war. In fact, this was part of the G20 communique as well. But the fact of the matter, Mr. Kant, is that we are in the midst of a war. The Russia-Ukraine war continues. Russia and Europe don't want to have anything to do with each other, don't want to be on any side of the table. How challenging does that make your task? Does that make India's task as far as the G20 is concerned?
It is challenging, but let me also say that this was challenging for Indonesia as well through the year. Every single meeting at ministerial level had failed. All through the year there was a deadlock. There was a scenario where the G7 countries were not even willing to talk to Russia. We finally, at the Bali Sherpa meeting, India played a very key and a very critical role. We convinced G7 that it can't be a very political statement, and therefore we said that G20 is essentially an economic grouping. It's a grouping for growth, financial progress, and therefore there is a need to the real political body is the UN Security Council, and therefore we India, along with Brazil, South Africa, Mexico, Argentina, it played a very critical role. Singapore joined us later. Many other countries joined up. We really convinced the G7 that let us fall back on the drafting done by the UN Security Council. We redrafted that entire para and the entire statement. And therefore, we convinced G7 that this is the way forward. And finally, then we went back and convinced Russia. And later, we convinced China as well. And therefore, India played a very key and critical role. And to my mind, India will continue to play that role of being a positive and a very constructive voice in G20. We will be forward-looking. We will try and bring consensus. The Prime Minister has very strongly said that this is an era of diplomacy and dialogue. It's not an era of war. It is a logical consequence of that is that this is an era of peace. And the more you have war, we will impact the lives of citizens. And therefore, that will be the sanity which India will try and bring in debate and discussion all through G20. We will bring positivity. We will bring a very, very deep voice of bringing in the entire thinking behind Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, and that one earth is one family, it's one future. That is, we are all part of one cosmic web, and that there has to be unity in diversity, and that we must work towards peace. That will be the central message that we'll bring in throughout our presidency.
You know, one of the other central messages that the Prime Minister has spoken of, Mr. Kant, in his op-ed today, when he talks about depoliticizing the global supply of food, fertilizer and medical products so that geopolitical tensions do not lead to humanitarian crises. Now, while this is something that is important that world leaders need to address, the fact of the matter is that countries also need to factor in their own national interests before they talk about the global good. Now, what could be the demonstrable action that India would like to put on the table to take this agenda forward? Because this is going to perhaps require more than just words. It's also going to require demonstrable action. What is it that we can expect from India specifically on this front of depoliticizing food, fertilizer and medical products?
So, Shireen, it's important to understand that if we are not allowing food to move from Ukraine and Russia, or if we do not allow fertilizer to move from Russia and Ukraine, next year's production of food will get impacted. The world will be on a very short supply of food, and vast segments of population across the world will actually get into hunger and malnutrition, and therefore the critical issue is of allowing food and fertilizer to move, and this needs to be totally depoliticized. Thirdly, it's important to understand that large number of countries are dependent on energy supply, gas supplies from Russia, and if you stop supplies from there, then logical consequence of that would be that manufacturing will get affected, entire global supply chains will get affected, and therefore it will lead to huge escalation of costs in manufacturing. So while there is geopolitical tension, we need to ensure that food, fertilizer and energy gets totally depoliticized. Complete sanctions on this will actually lead to escalation of prices, and that in turn, in case food and fertilizer are not able to move, would really impact vast number of people. So if you look at the Bali summit declaration, it actually everybody sat together and welcomed several moves, including the one by the United Nations, including the one by Turkey, including the one by UAE, so that we could allow all these things to move. And I honestly feel that you will have much action on this in the coming days, and you will see many of these things getting depoliticized despite the geographical tension. And it's necessary to do that. And the Prime Minister in his editorial has spoken about it at a philosophical level, elevating himself far beyond any other leader to bring these issues center stage, because these are issues which are really concerning the citizens of the world. He is talking about a human-centric approach to development. He's saying that irrespective of power politics, irrespective of geopolitics, we must be able to elevate ourselves as leaders to lead this world.
You know, Mr. Kant, you spoke about some of the breakthroughs that we have seen to ensure that the kind of disruptions that we saw on account of the Russia-Ukraine war, whether we talk about food or fertilizer, some of that pain is reduced. And, you know, that Turkey deal that you spoke of to allow the movement of grain between Russia and Ukraine, do you believe that today, given the impact that we are seeing, not just on citizens in Russia and Ukraine, but the impact of this around the world, that there is now space opening up for further movement on perhaps reviewing some of the sanctions that are in place?
See, it's important that to understand that sanctions also lead to a huge impact on supply of some of the essential goods and commodities, and therefore there have to be certain principles of sanction, and those principles of sanctions must apply in all moments of crisis, especially in moments of geopolitical crisis of this nature, because sanctions impact citizens across the country, particularly when they relate to sanctions on food, fuel and fertilizer. Now, there is a challenge on both sides of the geopolitical tension. It's the challenge as far as G7 is concerned. There's a challenge as far as Russia is concerned. So we need to debate and discuss these issues very, very carefully. These were discussed and debated at great length at the G7. And I think at the first Sherpa track meeting, which is being held in Udaipur, these issues will again be brought center stage to take them forward. Many of these issues are not economic in nature, but they have a deep implication on the economy. I mean, to say that these are G20 is not an economic, is not a forum for discussing issues of security, but issues, when you have a security issue of this nature, it has deep implications on economy. And therefore, when it has deep implications for economy, it's making certain countries totally cost, their competitiveness as manufacturing nation is getting impacted. There's huge implication on the lives of citizens. So many of these issues will come up for huge debate and discussion in the coming months during India's presidency.
Mr. Kant, one of the other important aspects that I want to touch upon, and that links back to the two priority areas that you spoke of, the challenge of a slowdown in growth, the challenge of returning to the path of forward movement as far as achieving the SDGs are concerned, particularly on poverty alleviation, the debt crisis that the world is currently faced with. The finance track, that is also going to take place in December in Bangalore. What is going to be the priority on that front?
So I think there are a couple of issues which are very critical, irrespective of whether it's the Sherpa track, where the development working group discusses most of these issues, and whether it's the finance track issues. And in India's case, we'll converge on several of these issues together. First and foremost, to my mind, finance track has to really think deeply on accelerating the pace of inclusive and resilient growth for the global economy, because without growth, you are not able to lift up these people. Secondly, I think there's a need for a very concerted action plan on revitalizing, as the United Nations Secretary General has said, that the responsibility for everyone is really to lift back people who've gone behind in the poverty race due to COVID. And that means that instead of focusing on every aspect of this sustainable development goals, can we focus on a few areas and really push for a concerted action on them, particularly education, health, nutrition. These are key areas. And thirdly, to my mind, the finance track has a very big responsibility because 70 countries around the world are really impacted by a global debt crisis. So once countries start falling apart, you'll see the whole financial architecture crumbling down. And the challenge there is that most global debt is presently handled by the Paris Club. Now, the Paris Club used to provide a lot of lending to developing countries, Franco companies at one point of time, but in the last few years, China has given a huge amount of debt to these countries. And therefore, it can't be that IMF provides a package like it has done in Sri Lanka, which goes to really pay the Chinese debt, which in several cases has been termed as opaque and non-transparent. So the China, IMF, and the private sector, all three need to sit together and work out a complete comprehensive package for these countries, and then provide that this package will be implemented across the board. In Indonesia, China objected to this and said that they will do a one-to-one deal on global, it is their debt and they will deal one-to-one. Now, that will be a challenge, and I think we need to discuss this out during our presidency so that we are able to bring everybody together on a global debt package. This is critical. This, to my mind, is very, very critical. And the third key issue, to my mind, will be this issue of crypto, which, it's not an issue which one country can tackle. India has been saying this, that everyone needs to work together to have one single unified policy framework, both on crypto as an asset class and crypto as a digital currency. So these are issues which IMF has been asked to look into. Their policy framework will be, their draft policy framework and their inputs will be a critical input into the G20 framework. These are some key issues which I can highlight.
Just on that issue, sir, because, we are currently talking about cryptos in the context of a crypto collapse. We've seen what's happening with crypto exchanges on the back of the FTX debacle. Now, India was contemplating moving a bill in Parliament. We tried that twice. We pulled it back. The RBI has been vociferous in its opposition to any kind of crypto, saying that there should be a complete ban. At this point in time, India has decided to tax crypto or virtual assets. What is our position likely to be on this, given now the current global experience, as well as the position of the Reserve Bank and what we have heard from other G20 members? What is the position that India is likely to take on cryptos?
So, Shireen, this is an issue which is discussed in the finance track, but there are two components to the crypto issue. One is crypto as a currency. Crypto as a currency, the Reserve Bank of India is fully right that they are working on a digital currency. You can't use crypto as a currency. That's one aspect of it, and therefore they are very, very firm on the view that don't allow crypto to be used as a currency. But then there is the other issue of crypto as an asset class. Now, crypto as an asset class is something which the government has not yet taken. The earlier issues were struck down by the Supreme Court, and then crypto as an asset class is something where the policy framework is still evolving. And what the government of India has really said is that you need a unified policy across the globe. And that policy framework needs to be drafted by a body like IMF. I think the IMF is doing work on this. And once that would be subjected to discussion during the G20 discussions.
Mr. Kant, always a pleasure. Appreciate you joining us here today to take us through the priorities that India intends to focus on as it assumes the presidency of the G20. We wish you the very best of luck and appreciate your time this evening. That's Amitabh Kant, India's G20 Sherpa, taking us through what the agenda is going to be. Remember, the execution starts today. With that, it is time for us to wrap up this edition of the Newsmaker. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned. The news continues.